Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning. We are traversing all parts of the world's time zones, and I'm delighted to be welcoming you to the third day of the India Policy Forum. My co-editors and I, who are both here, Barry Bosworth at Brookings, Karthik Muralidharan at the University of California, San Diego, and I'm Shekhar Shah at NCER. This is the third day of a 4-day experiment in conferencing across time zones and countries and regions. So far, I have to say that I've been impressed at how smoothly things have gone, but it's for you to judge. The panelists who you see on the screen and a large number of attendees who are also with us and equally important to us. As I said on earlier days, the editors and I discussed the IPF this year, and after some initial hesitation about obviously a physical face-to-face conference, we decided that we had to have a conference, however we organized it. And so here we are, a virtual conference, the India Policy Forum, for the first time in 17 years, and of course for the first time in modern history, the world facing a crisis that it has not seen since certainly 1980. We have a rich set of sessions today too. First, we start with a roundtable, which Dr. Ashok Lahiri will share. He, I believe, is on his way in getting logged in. He and I spoke just a few minutes back, and I think somebody is helping him log in, and he will take over the chairing of the session. The roundtable that he was going to introduce is about what does the pandemic teach us about India's safety net challenges. And we have a distinguished panel, Ashok Lahiri, of course, chairing it, member of the 15th Finance Commission, and a very strong established economist in the research and policy-making worlds in India. And on the panel itself, we have Abhijit Banerjee, who is going to join us by video, since he had a commitment that he could not get out of, but he probably will try and join us towards the end of our session. But I will play the video to start this session. Karthik Muralidharan will then come in, thereafter followed by Renana Jhabvala, Chairperson of SEWA, and finally, to round up the panel, Dr. T.V. Somanathan, Expenditure Secretary in the Ministry of Finance here in New Delhi. So this is a very strong lineup, and we're looking forward very much to the conversation that I hope will ensue in this roundtable. The rules for this video conference, Zoom conference, are fairly simple. Please keep your microphones muted, and when you wish to pose a question, for those who are on the screen and panelists, please raise your hand. You can click on the participants icon at the bottom. Your name will show up in a list on the right-hand side. Just go to your name and you will see an option you can choose for raise hand, and then the chair will know that you have a question. For our colleagues who are on the attendees list, there's a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Please click that, write in your question, and we will try to answer as many of those as we can during the session, and of course share the entire transcript of the chat session with the authors and the discussants, and hopefully they will also be getting back to you. So I'm going to switch now to the video of our panel member, Nobel Prize winner, Economics 2019, Abhijit Banerjee.
Hi, sorry that I can't be there. I have a great deal of loyalty to IPF, and I feel bad about not being there, but I've pre-committed to something else. So this will have to do. This is obviously the topic of the day. I can't imagine something more important to talk about. And in a sense, India is probably almost kind of test case for many of the things that can go right or can go wrong. And I think in India, I feel that we're at this point. So I think there are three critical, I would say, mistakes, but maybe these are not so much mistakes as just things that haven't got done, which are now really coming to hurt us. And we list them and talk about them a little bit, and I'll talk a little bit about what that says about short-term policy and long-term policy. So, and the first one is we have no empirical base or policy base for understanding migration. Internal migration is an enormous part of India's growth story. It's the reason why people at some point noted that, you know, in the last UPA years, you see a big reduction in poverty, and that happening in states like Bihar and UP, where there's a lot of growth. And one of the big parts of that story is clearly migration. It's just people are going to work all over the country, and that bringing the growth back home. I think that's a huge part of what was happening. And in general, I think what this has exposed is we don't even know how many migrants, where they're from, where are they located, how do they live. None of these questions, our data collection apparatus isn't really designed to pick this up. We don't pick it up because a lot of the questions are domicile based. And if you are living in a construction site, sleeping under a shed, or sleeping under your truck where you work, you just don't register anywhere. And we could have pretended for a while that this was a small number of people, but we now know it's a huge number of people. We have really no way of, likewise, we have no way of you know, systematically extending help to them, because in a sense they don't exist, and they're not transparent to the system, they don't enter any database, etc. So I think that's a very basic problem that is being exposed now, that they don't really, we have a very large, we don't know how large, but you know, many million population that's kind of adrift, moving from one city to another. We don't know where they live, who they are, etc. So that's one thing that I think we'll just have to think harder about and deal with. Second problem, which is related, is housing. I think we have housing is our classic jugaad strategy. We've never really taken on the challenge of providing housing. That's partly why the migrants have no place to really put up, because it's just too expensive. Real estate strategies have always been one of, you know, there is, you know, people grab land, and now there's even very little land to grab. And then if not, there is no other way of getting land that's affordable anywhere near work. And so people just stay somewhere. But that jugaad strategy and the flip side of that, which is the slums, they together are, at this point, I think those two are really biting us, because at some level I would say that if the migration really stops, if the migrants decide that, look, it's just too scary to be in Delhi, or in, you know, it's just too painful to be there. I know that, for example, in Tamil Nadu, they're sending buses to West Bengal and Orissa to bring workers back, because they're trying to start factories in Western Tamil Nadu, and they're not getting all the workers to come back. They're trying to recruit local workers, wages are happening. This is going to be a major drag on the growth process and then the sharing of the growth process. The kind of shared growth will also be The sharing will be very different, worse in a sense, and I think in a sense it also will be much more the growth process. I think I just thought of, what do I do if the factory closes or the truck is blocked, go down because now we have a lockdown. Where do I stay? What do I do? And I think it's a lot of these people have been listening to them on TV and in Bangla TV and things like that. And it's very clear that they are like just telling stories of horror stories. And these horror stories have now propagated throughout these areas. People are going to be reluctant to come back. And we'll have to think of what come back. And we'll have to think of what one does to reassure them. I think that's a second where we had, in a sense, low cost, bunch of low cost in construction industries where the costs were kept down because the workers could sleep on the site or something, and those kinds of things have their limits, and I think this was exposed that. The final or an obvious one is the welfare system. Our welfare system is all domicile based. We have to, to the extent there is one that's domicile based. You have a clear domicile, there you can get, at least you can get rations, maybe you can get something else. But it's really, and even Narega, you're really not entitled to Narega unless you're domicile. So, anything that you can possibly access. And there is actually, there I would say there's been significant progress, and even in this crisis, the government has tried to use these instruments. And that brings me to this first point I want to make on the policy question. I think starting from here, what do we do? So in the short run, I would say, other than, I think the government basic general thinking about this, which is use whatever instruments we have to give people some money, that's probably a good instinct. I think the amounts are wrong. I think the amounts should be bigger because I think it's going to be a longer and more painful recovery, and I think that all of that will demand a more generous system. But I think that in the middle of this, redesigning systems is a bad idea. I think the bureaucratic capacity is stretched to the limit. I happen to be working with the West Bengal government, so I know pretty much how much of the effort of the chief secretary and the chief minister and everybody is just, COVID is the only thing they're concerned about. Everything else is kind of second order. I just don't think this is a time to design new systems. So I think we'll have to make do with what we have and do a piecemeal, hopefully if you don't get the money, maybe somebody in your close network gets some money and somehow it works out. It's terrible. I hate to have to say this, but I don't think it's fair for people to be hit by a very large shock for which they have no way of insuring, and we are not going to really insure them because we don't even know who they are and they're not really identified to the system, etc. So I think that's one problem that's been exposed. The second problem is that, so I think in the very short run, don't try to do much. In particular, I like the idea for the medium run of one nation, one ration card. In the very short run, I worry that the implementation of that will lead to lots of exclusions about, are you a citizen? Are you a this? Are you a that? Are you entitled to it? Do you have one ration card in your name, some in West Bengal and one in your name in Delhi? I think all of those questions should not be asked. At this point, it would be good to give anybody who wants one, give them a ration card. I think that's the way to go, a temporary one, and then we go back. In particular, I think that there is a real concern that in West Bengal, we can see that we are in our city, and we can see that lots of the messages that were sent out just didn't register. People, I know this because I recorded a bunch of videos and I sent it to, I think, 27 million households. I recorded them in my name, and they were all about, this is what you do, that is what I was persuaded that, maybe if, because of this Nobel Prize and all that, people will know who I am. And in fact, they did, and we see very large impacts. 20% reduction in increase in hand washing, things like that, very, very large reductions, improvements. So I think people, even if the message is out there, people don't necessarily listen. Second clue we have is our city we did in the US, where we sent the same information, this kind of, what are you supposed to do with COVID, to a bunch of African-American families. And what's very clear there is that the message, when it comes from a white doctor, we randomize who delivers the message, white doctor or, a government person or an African-American doctor, you can see that it makes a very big difference to not whether they hear they have the information, they get the information if a white person sends it, but they actually ignore it. They only act on it when it comes from. So I think trust in the system is very important at this point. And I would say, keeping that in mind, it's very important that we don't get into the politics of who is entitled to what. Because I think that will further undermine trust in the system. I think that's a very important thing to keep in mind, is that this is a time where trust is extremely important. It has to be, that the government is able to say, look, what we're doing, it looks weird, it's horrible, but it makes sense. And when you're trying to get people to swallow a bitter pill, it's really hard to do it without getting people to trust what's being said. So that's the short run. In the medium run, I think one nation, one ration card based on really a very generous interpretation of who's entitled to it would be a very good thing. I think that would be, I'm confident that would be a good idea. I think that I also have, I think, a lot of sympathy for the idea that, there should be, a growth dividend of the kind that Karthik has talked about. And I think this is important. We call something very similar in our book. We called it the Universal Ultra Basic Income, UUBI. And I think this very similar idea, and I think that's worth doing, but I think it's worth being clear why it's worth doing. It's not going to actually solve the problem of COVID directly, because in fact we have evidence on that from Kenya, where we have this very large, with Karthik's colleague Paul Niehaus, we have this very large experiment on UBI. And one of the things very clear from that experiment is that that the impacts, there is an impact of being in a UBI, being covered by UBI on whether of hunger, etc. The effects are not small, but they're not huge either. And I think part of the reason they're not huge is that, of course, people are strategic. So you give them a guaranteed income, they change their risk-taking. And what happens is start businesses, and business incomes get shattered by COVID. So in the end, they don't gain so much, because in fact, they have now invested a lot of the money from the UBI into all kinds of things. So that's one of the ways in which we have to think about the endogenous response of people. And that makes me less optimistic that that's the strategy that's going to save us from something. And large unexpected shocks are the thing that we'll have to deal with with specific interventions. They're not going to be dealt with generic things. Now, why does UBI still matter? Because I think it is very important to open channels, to have a way of sending more money. And I think that should not be piecemeal. It should not be based on you're a farmer or not a farmer, etc. It should be citizenship based. And I have some views on how we could target it better. In very limited targeting, I think, can be done without, with some self-selection. But I think in general, I'm for opening the pathways. I think that the pathway is important. Final thing on welfare is we have to think about housing. I'm sort of more and more convinced that, the slums, where, it's just impossible in Dharavi, the effort they put into, I think they did a brilliant job in Dharavi actually. But what they had to do was Herculean, and sort of, that's what they did. They really pulled off something of a very impressive control set of measures, pulling everybody out of Dharavi when who was sick, putting them elsewhere, did all kinds of things. That can't be done. If this is going to be a recurrent problem, then the government needs to have more bandwidth to do other things. It just needs to be more automatic. And one of the things that will do that is just make housing where, so one of the things that's a big problem is you tell people to isolate. Where will they isolate? We're really not creating housing commensurate with anything. So you tell people, and that's why a lot of the successful cities are where you're getting the worst outcomes, because that's where housing is most expensive. And so that's predictable in a sense, once you understand what's going on. And people just live in incredibly dense places. And that's going to be, so those are my, so for the short run, I think we keep doing what we're doing. One last point maybe I wanted to make was that Narega, I think in the short run we're using Narega. In the long run, we need to think about Narega is actually not designed, again, for anything sort of emergency response, because what Narega has built in is this kind of this local control, which means that you have to propose something. When you propose something, we accept that we fund it, etc. But all of that means that it's not going to be immediate. So if it's suddenly that something strikes in the middle of February or March, middle of March, and we haven't really gone through the steps. Narega is not really designed for that. So we need to also, I think we need to rethink the entire welfare system. And I think in that context, we also need to take into account the urbanization of poverty and how we find something commensurate for the urban population. So that's another task for the, maybe that's the fourth thing I wanted to say. This is sort of maybe laying out an agenda for the medium run. I think in the short run, the government really, I think, should loosen the purse strings. But other than that, it seems to me that trying to invent new instruments is a bad idea in general. So with that, let me thank the audience for listening to me, and I will hope to be more engaged with IPF in the future. This time, after the first day, I really was too busy. So thank you.
So actually, I want to thank Abhijit for an incredible, as you may have seen from the quality of the lighting, this was recorded at 11:30 at night after a very long day when Karthik and he spoke, and he very kindly sent us this message. He will try and join us at 7:30, and of course we'll have a chance then to chat with him if he's able to do so. Ashok is here, I believe. Ashok, are you here?
I'm here.
You are here. Very good. Should I hand over to you? Very good. Excellent. Should I hand over to you? We've had, as you've heard, Abhijit, and it's Karthik who's supposed to go next. Ashok?
Thank you very much. I'm sorry my technological backwardness showed up. I had registered for the wrong day, and that's why I had to re-register and get here. I had the privilege of listening to Abhijit. Now it's a star-studded panel. Karthik, of course, Abhijit doesn't need an introduction, and Shekhar has already told you who he is. Karthik is one of the guys who has worked for a long time on optimal design of interventions in areas like education policy, and we're lucky to have him here. I'll just pose 2-3 questions. One, what Abhijit said about universal basic income, then portable ration cards. I know it's a war. So when there is a war going on, you don't think about purse strings, you don't think about how you win the war, whether it's efficient or not. But there are long-run questions as well. We neglected education and health to create an industrial infrastructure and also for planning. We are suffering now. If we spend too much on welfare measures, you can always say that the money will be spent for other things and it will not go into education and health. But do medium-term priorities and long-term priorities, should that be put on a higher order? My second question relates to that when this pandemic has shown us what is the shortage of ICUs, ventilators, hospital beds, and so on, when primary health continues to suffer. So will there be a knee-jerk reaction in the allocation in the health sector as far as primary, secondary, and tertiary healthcare is concerned? Third is the issue of housing that Abhijit brought out. That's a major problem. Chaotic urbanization has been our problem. Will the problem be compounded if we make the ration card portable? Right now, I think twice before I migrate wherever I want, because at least my ration card and other entitlements are on domicile basis. The Chinese had a hukou system. I'm not saying the hukou system is right, but just as we upgrade our housing facilities, which we must, should we also try to have some kind of orderly urbanization in terms of inflows into cities? So these are 3 questions that I wanted to put to the panelists. If they like to respond to it, I'll be grateful. Thank you. Karthik, over to you.
Thanks, Ashok. Excellent. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All good. Yeah, excellent questions. But I will defer that to the discussion and try to stick to the 4 key points I wanted to make. So first of all, I think the timing is it couldn't be more appropriate, and Abhijit's already said a bunch of the things I was going to say. So I think we almost planned that he would lay out some concepts and I would get a little bit more into the details. So I think there's 4 main points I want to get across to the audience today. I think, the first, and I would almost argue the most important, is that there is an old tradition in public finance, public economics, and also a belief among taxpayers in general that spending on social protection is charity and that this actually negatively affects incentives to work. So, the thousands of public finance papers talking about how these welfare programs can reduce incentives to work. I think, what is really important to recognize is that the contra PF, there is a very large development economics literature that highlights that when people are really, really poor, that there can often be no conflict between equity and efficiency, and that in fact, well-designed social protection programs can enhance economic efficiency. So, one of the best known papers of this is by Abhijit Banerjee and Maitreesh Ghatak, who's here on the panel, who's here in the I see him here. And Paul Gertler showing how the land reforms in West Bengal and Operation Barga actually not only improve title for the poor, but improve productivity by improving security of title. Similarly, my own work on NREGA, I started out, to be honest, on NREGA as a skeptic. And I have been on the record, as many economists in about 15 years ago, wondering if increasing wages without increasing productivity would actually hurt the economy. But what we've seen now in our large-scale randomized control trials in Andhra Pradesh has really been kind of an eye-opener, because what we've seen is that a better implemented NREGA has not only improved wages, but also improved employment and improved longer-term economic activity. So it's kind of stunning how broad the positive effects are. So we see increases in credit, increases in assets, increases in non-agricultural enterprises, increases in non-agricultural employment. So, and the key driver for this ends up being that there is a fair bit of market power that landlords have. So when you go into the situation where the poor have so little bargaining power and so little outside options, essentially improving those outside options can substantially improve productivity. And, it's useful to go back and think about how does the process of development happen? Development is the aggregation of individual decisions to undertake investments that have a positive return, okay? But we've got dozens of studies in micro development economics talking about the constraints and market failures that prevent the poor from making those investments. So if you're a farmer and we want you to diversify into a more productive crop, we have dozens of papers showing how in the early years that can actually reduce profits, because it's risky to try something new and learn something new that may have higher returns, but having a little bit of a social protection cushion can make it easier to make those investments that then get you into a higher long-term trajectory. So I think the first most important message I want to get across is that well-designed social protection programs. Now, well-designed is a key point. You can't just throw money and expect these things will happen. Well-designed social protection programs, there is often no conflict between equity and efficiency. And so to the extent that a unifying principle of how we approach our post-COVID responses is that, like Ashok was saying, you don't want to have knee-jerk reactions of throwing money in a way that compromises the fundamentals. But the good news is that there are a series of reforms that are both going to help in the short term and be consistent with improving long-term fundamentals. So the first point is just, let's not think about social protection as charity, but let's think about it as the foundation of supporting a broad-based economic recovery for additional reasons that I'll come to. The second key point is what Abhijit mentioned, and this is actually, I'm glad Ashok raised this point because it's actually contra what Ashok said. And I think the importance of national portability of our benefit structure of social protection could not be more, emphasized. And I strongly commend the government for its move towards one nation, one ration, because I think, one very common reaction to this migrant crisis has been to say, oh, we need to create the jobs in the rural areas, in the poor areas, so that you don't need the migration in the first place. But while this is well-intentioned, I think this is exactly, it's wrong and it's completely misguided. So, we've got data from almost every development process in history that shows that urbanization is one of the strongest drivers of development, both in terms of the agglomeration externalities and the greater productivity of jobs in the urban areas. So again, when we look at the squalid conditions in urban areas, it's easy to make this mistake and say, oh my God, life in the slums is so bad. But it is so important to remember that this is reflecting the fact that the alternative is so much worse that people choose to do that. And going back to Ashok's point, it tells you how much bigger kind of the productivity and wage wedge is between rural and urban areas, that people are even willing to give up their benefits to be willing, to make this move to where higher productivity is. And again, going back to my unifying theme of saying, let's think about the social protection wins that will also enhance fundamental reforms and productivity. I think reducing spatial misallocation between where the jobs are and where the workers are should be a national priority, and making the welfare structure more portable is exactly a step in the right direction. So I think, I agree with Abhijit that in the short term, this idea that we should kind of perhaps ease up a little bit on identity requirements to make sure people have their benefits. But in the medium term, building a nationally portable benefits architecture could be one of the great benefits that comes out of our response to this crisis. The third point which I want to make is, and I'll spend the most time on this, which is, developing again the idea that Maitreesha and I wrote up in this paper for the IPF last year. And, at the risk of repetition, but the timing could not be more appropriate, right? And so this is the paper we wrote last year called An Inclusive Growth Dividend, Reframing the Role of Income Transfers in India's Anti-Poverty Policy. And the basic idea is very, very simple. I think, people have been talking about UBIs and income transfers. It's a very old one. The main, I think, tactical problem has been that the traditional UBI, which is construed as an amount that will allow you to eliminate poverty, is just too expensive. And so, there's just no fiscal space to do this. Estimates in the past have ranged from 3.5 to 10%. And that's made that idea infeasible without getting into discussions of what programs you're going to stop. And that is both politically and ethically difficult. So I think our very strong view here is that less is more. And we propose a modest but powerful approach called an inclusive growth dividend that we peg at 1% of GDP per capita. So it's 120 rupees a month per person. For a household of 4, that's about 500 rupees. And 2 or 3 key design features are that it would be paid at the individual level and with funds for children below 16 or below 18 going into their mother's accounts. It would be supplemental rather than substitute. And the default is universal, but you can exclude the top end either through measures of income tax payments or a give it up component. But I think the case for the inclusive growth dividend, one of the main points we're doing in this paper is highlighting, I think part of the problem again with the cash transfer debate is so much of it has been phrased in terms of anti-poverty policy as a response to the leaky social safety net that we have. And I think we've kind of lost the plot a little bit, right? Because there's literally thousands of papers in micro development economics that talk about the micro constraints that the very poor face to development, including a whole range of issues from credit to insurance to and I think our view here is that the case for this is so strong, and we wrote this whole paper, but let me just reiterate about 9 major advantages, right? I think the first is that's affordable enough to be feasible. So discussing the terminology of an inclusive growth dividend, at some level, the idea is not that different from a UBI or more specifically a UBS, a Universal Basic Share that Debraj Ray has written about. Pranab's written about this many times. Vijay Joshi's written about this, Sunil Khilnani. So the idea per se is not that new. I think the main point we're making is that by phrasing a lot of this discussion in terms of what are we going to substitute, you have basically lost the momentum of the value of cash transfers as one or income transfers as one component of a portfolio of anti-poverty policies and broad-based social protection. So the word dividend captures the fact that nobody expects a dividend to give you enough income to live on, but it is one component of a portfolio. It is inclusive because it is universal. So by construction, there is no exclusion error. And it is the word growth captures that this is an element of national socially shared prosperity that unifies all citizens regardless of your station. You get progressive, inclusive, and sustained poverty reduction. So again, sitting in Delhi or Bombay, it's easy to laugh and saying 500 rupees a month is peanuts, or 120 rupees a month. Like, why are we even bothering? But what we show in the paper is that for the bottom 10% of the income distribution, this can augment monthly consumption by almost 20%. And for the bottom 50%, this would augment consumption by 10%. And so, and that's a non-trivial increase. And again, it is progressive because this means much more for the poor. And it's also, and this is a point I made to Ashok in the context of the Finance Commission. It also helps some of the spatial redistribution goals we may have, because by construction, the poorer people are in the poorer states. Now, there's another very important point which I think is not appreciated enough, which is of rank preservation and social acceptability. So what a lot of research shows on why kind of the lower middle class often kind of rebels against anti-poverty programs is because people are very conscious not just of absolutes, but of their relative standing in a social hierarchy. So the problem with a program like NCAER is when you go in and saying, I'm going to identify the bottom 20% and give them a big transfer, you're kind of, the 19th percentile person is now going to be much better off than the 21st percentile. And that rank reversal can be very, very unpopular and almost lead to sabotage of some of these welfare programs, right? So by construction, what you've done here is you've solved that sociological problem because it's lifting every boat equally by a modest amount. And relatedly, it does not affect work incentives because the amount is too small to actually reduce incentive for work, but it can just be enough to lubricate some of these frictions in the development process. And almost almost all the micro development evidence I can marshal on this suggests that there is, in fact, Abhijit's done a review paper on this. There has never been evidence of negative incentives on negative effects on work incentives. And if anything, there's suggestive evidence of positive effects on work incentives. I think the other key part here that makes this align with the government's priorities is female empowerment and improved intra-household targeting, right? So we've done a lot of work with the Jan Dhan accounts, but again, tons of research shows that providing some resources directly controlled by the woman is one of the most effective ways of improving intra-household bargaining power, and the ability, and in particular for the allowance of the children to go into the mother's account, could be a real game changer in this. There's a lovely paper recently by Rosella Calvi and others showing how there is a lot of, because we do targeting based on households, there are a lot of rich people in poor households and poor people in non-poor households because of the intra-household inequality, which is particularly the brunt borne by women and the elderly. You get financial inclusion. Again, the government has massively prioritized this with the Jan Dhan accounts, and enormous progress has been made. But I think by last accounts, there's still a substantial amount of inactive and dormant accounts. And so simply moving the money in on a regular basis cleans up the pipes and make sure that that plumbing is working. You encourage savings, you crowd in credit, you mitigate risk, and provide a modest amount of insurance. Again, these are textbook issues that micro development economists have studied over the years, and we have very strong reason to believe that this could help alleviate those. I think the part that I also get excited about is the piece about augmenting state capacity, and not just state capacity, but state credibility. And, just doing this would be the first time in independent India that a government has managed to deliver a benefit credibly month after month to every citizen. And I know Dr. Somanathan, I think in the media a couple of months ago, when people were asking about cash transfers, said it's actually harder to do than you think, right? We don't have ways of identifying the migrants. We don't have ways of identifying. So, and I think Jan Dhan Aadhaar gets you 80% of the way. So it's not like you need to recreate the entire wheel. But this will allow you to finish that last 20% and build the state capacity that gives you the options to respond, not just to future crises, but also for other kinds of policy reforms. And there's a related part, which is state credibility, which is we are at a time, and we've again seen this discussion yesterday, when in a world where the government is obviously navigating without a map and often announcements change here and there, it's very hard for people to even know who to believe. So getting just something credibly month after month would augment state credibility in a way that goes alongside state capacity. And I think at a time, it creates this powerful symbol of shared solidarity, which I think is especially important now in a time of crisis. I think one of my big concerns is there's, again, tons of research showing how times of economic contraction are associated with increased social conflict. And this would be one way of mitigating that, by sending a message that we're all in this together, that regardless of station, here is one common benefit. And finally, channeling the idea that all the best economics in the world will not happen if it is not politically compelling. This is one of these beautiful cases where I could not have written the slogan better myself, right? So, this becomes a textbook example of Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas, and Sabka Vishwas, right? It couldn't be better, right? So, here is a program that reaches every citizen and hence demonstrates Sabka Saath. Here is something that is going to kickstart a bunch of development for the reasons we've talked about, which is Sabka Vikas, and getting the government to be credible in the eyes of every citizen, and hence getting Sabka Vishwas. So to the extent that we want a program that aligns with the stated political priorities of the government, this could be a signature program that the government does and becomes a legacy, just like NREGA was for the UPA. And it's kind of ironic that the government, in responding to this crisis, actually the main instruments you had were augmenting PDS and augmenting NREGA. And it makes sense, because those are the instruments you have the capacity to do. So this then becomes the natural culmination of the investment in Jan Dhan Aadhaar and mobile, and kind of becomes a crowning legacy in some ways of what this government has done. And in my last minute, I think, it would be irresponsible to talk about spending without saying something about the financing. And, I think, again, I've written on this, others have written on this. We all understand that the broad principles here are some combination of revenue, some of cutting other expenditure, of borrowing and printing money. But let me just say two very, very important things, right? I think what we heard from Prachi yesterday and a lot of the discussions yesterday is that right now bond markets are not concerned about deficits per se. What they want is a plan. What they want is clarity, that the government understands that being too conservative may also be a mistake. And so So now there is a good reason why these 3%, I mean, we all know that 3% is a completely arbitrary target. If you're borrowing for a project that has a high positive social return, you should do it. The problem is bond markets don't trust governments that you will spend on things that are productive as opposed to other kind of freebies that may be politically lucrative. But I think making a compelling case around the kind of using this as a way of restarting the economy, the fact that in Kenya, in these studies, we've seen fiscal multipliers of about 2.7 means that, and that's going to be higher in a time of depressed demand, that this is going to pay for itself very, very fast. So I think there is a responsible way of phrasing what this expenditure means that is not going to spook out bond markets. If anything, it's going to make them more convinced that this is going to support a broad-based recovery. Because when I talk to my friends in industry, I think, the government's choice of supporting the recovery through credit has been prudent, but, you're not going to get that without the demand. So I think there's an element of kind of, and, there's a deep way in which this is also consistent with Atmanirbhar, because I think people like Ratin Roy and I'm forgetting Harish Chawla and others have noted that the structure of the Indian economy for the past 20 years has been driven by the top 5% or 10% who have the jobs that then create demand. But one of the key pieces of Atmanirbhar is not just kind of protection, but building the base of domestic demand that then pivots domestic industry to produce for domestic consumers. So again, this is a way in which this is consistent, not just with anti-poverty, but with supporting a broader economic recovery, that I feel very confident that the bond markets will allow that fiscal space to allow something like this to happen. So let me stop there and I'll address some of Ashok's other points in the discussion.
Well,
thank you so much.
Thank you, Karthik. Since Pranab Babu is here, he mentioned somewhere that all the stakeholders in India have got a veto. So the problem is we can think of lots of virtuous things to spend on, but we don't know what we can withdraw. So as a result, from 2003, we have been talking about fiscal responsibility, but 17 years have passed. Even now, we say, yes, we'll consolidate, but not now and here. I think it's an extreme challenge to convince anyone that this time it's different. And this time we are going to restructure our expenditure and spend on things that we should spend on, and not continue with those, and people can exercise their veto on what cannot be withdrawn and how taxes cannot be increased, and we just add on to expenditure. Now, without further ado, I'll ask Renana Jhabvala. She is an outstanding social worker. We all know about her, the great work she has done in organizing cooperatives and self-help group among the women and furthering their rights as workers. So we look forward to hearing you. Over to you, Ms. Jhabvala.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm very pleased to be coming after Karthik, because there's a lot of things that he said which I fully agree with. And I will start with the basic income, what he talked about, some form of basic income, which would be a regular cash transfer to almost universally. There have been many discussions on should there be an exclusion criteria, and I think I would also support that rather than an inclusion criteria. I'd also like to point out that had we had some form of basic income in place now, this would have been an excellent way in which government could have transferred cash to people. Government did have mechanisms or attempts to transfer cash, but since we had no mechanism in place, since that basic income did not exist, that was very sporadic. So had that mechanism been in place, we would have not perhaps seen those huge migration of all those migrants going back home, had they had a certain amount of cash in their hands. We don't have a basic income, and I also want to support what Karthik said, that a basic income is not completely that you get rid of poverty. I'd like to remind that I think SEWA had done the largest study, sort of an action research on basic income, where we had studied 12,000 families, 12,000 individuals, sorry, and had given them a basic small amount. Karthik is talking about 120 per person. We had given 300 per person and 150 to the children. And the children's amount went into the mother's account, which was empowering for the women. So this is, and what had we found? A lot of what Karthik said. We found that people's nutrition improved. We found their health improved. We found education improved. We found that there was no increase in alcoholism, which is something that people often talk about. And in some places, to our surprise, there was a decrease in alcoholism. And I think an important thing that we found was that people's income increased because they started using part of their basic income in investing in assets, investing in livestock, investing in seeds, and actually increasing the productivity. And to our surprise, when we went back 5 years later, we found that in fact, about 50% of the people were even better off, and only 10% of the people had regressed, and the rest were sort of at the same level that we had left them 5 years ago. So nobody, very, very few people actually regressed back, and a lot of them actually, even for 1 year of basic income, actually progressed. And I think that is a very important evidence that this is something that can really help, really changing poverty, but more than changing poverty, also giving a security social net or a social security net to people. So I think that when we go back to normal times, at this time, of course, suddenly doing it is not possible, but it is a social security measure that should and can be considered. And as Karthik pointed out, if you're giving a certain amount of money, you're not giving an amount that would make, again, that would challenge employment, or that would be like the poverty, the minimum wage, the poverty line. If you're only giving a certain amount, then the financial considerations are not that huge. I don't actually agree, Karthik, with your strong endorsement of NREGA. I fully agree that NREGA has had very positive effects, but the positive effects are not because of the creation of assets or the work that they've done. It's because there's a cash transfer in people's hands. So, and NREGA is cumbersome. I think we do a lot of work with NREGA at the ground. Getting a job card is cumbersome. Getting the work done or getting the work set up is cumbersome. Getting the money to people is cumbersome. I mean, just starting off getting the money to the panchayat is cumbersome. So there's a huge mechanism. And of course, as you know, at least 50%, and usually it's more, of that fund actually goes into materials and other costs. So only 50% is really goes into the hands of the people. So I do think that there should be some way in which NREGA can be converted into a pure cash transfer. The one advantage, of course, of NREGA is that it is exclusionary. So only people who are willing to do hard manual labor will actually get it. But is that what we want to promote? That only people who are doing hard manual labor should get any safety net? So I think I would really think that one should rethink NREGA and see how can you convert it into a pure cash transfer. I'd like to say a bit about mechanisms, because policies is one thing, but the mechanisms, the actual way in which it is implemented is very important. And this crisis has really thrown up the gaps in the mechanisms. In order to help people survive during the lockdown. The government had a large number of things that they did. I'm not going to list them all, but just give 3 examples which showed up the gaps. The first example, of course, is the ration cards. As we know, in the beginning, only those who had ration cards could get rations. That did change over time, and different state governments adopted different ways in which they could give rations to non-ration card holders. In Delhi, for example, they started issuing e-coupons. In some states, they'd use the Aadhaar card and so on. But the real gap is that large numbers of people don't have ration cards. And of course, what everybody has pointed out, the portability of ration cards also does not exist. The portability is a difficult issue. And just digressing to say one word about that, what we saw with the migrants is their ration card is of course in their village, their name is in their village, but you cannot transfer the whole ration card to their name because the family is still collecting the rations. So it's not just a matter of making a ration card portable. It's also, can you divide the ration card? Can you give the migrant a migrant ration card and leave the family ration card with the family? So I think that issue really needs to be thought of. And the migrant ration card, or when the migrant is domiciled in a different place, then how do you get a ration card to them for that particular place? I think that's the issue that's the gap that came out. Of course, the other gap, of course, was that a lot of people who were also domiciled and who were not migrants also didn't have ration cards. So the lack in many states did come out. The second thing that came out, the other big gap, is the Jan Dhan. Now, Jan Dhan, the government was transferring 500 rupees to Jan Dhan accounts. I think studies have shown that about 40% of people were actually getting that. And although most people in the rural areas especially, and among the bottom of the pyramid do have Jan Dhan accounts, many of them were non-operational because they had not been using them. There was no money coming through. They did not know about it. They did not know which bank to go to, and so on. So because the Jan Dhan accounts have not been used, except say in pensions or for certain other types of benefits like disability, the Jan Dhan accounts really, just having them, people have not been using them. And so that was another big gap. A third big gap that came out was construction workers were supposed to get a certain amount of money, and construction workers were the main migrants. Every state, and this is something that is a big issue anyway, even on normal times, each state has a construction workers board and a construction workers fund. And each fund has crores and crores of funds in them. But those funds are not spent because construction workers don't get registered. When they get registered, they don't get renewed. And when they get renewed and registered, very few of them left, then it's very difficult to get any benefits out of the fund. And I think because all these funds had money in them, the government said that construction workers should get money. And where it worked, like I know Tamil Nadu was doing fairly well, Punjab, oddly enough, was doing fairly well, and Delhi had practically no construction workers registered, though it has about 800, 900 crores just sitting there. So, that's another big gap that existed. Another thing I wanted to say, we saw the problem with the unorganized, migrants, but there is a much bigger issue which we really need to address, which is the unorganized sector or the informal sector. There is a huge labor force which is neither documented nor registered, and most of it goes through contract labor. And it's not just the COVID crisis where we did not know who they were and therefore could not reach them. It's also during other disasters. So many cases where there's a fire in a warehouse or a fire in a factory, or the factory, I know of the collapse of a whole factory and nobody knew who died because all those workers were not registered anywhere. And so even when the government wanted to give insurance or give the families money for them, give them insurance, it was not possible. And that is, I think, something that needs to be really addressed. The government has something called the Code on Social Security, which has not yet reached Parliament. I think it's still in with the Parliament Committee. And part of that deals with the unorganized sector. And one of the clauses is that every worker gets registered. And I think if we can do that, that would really go to solving problems, at least during disasters, whether it's a disaster like COVID or it's a disaster like fires. It would go towards solving this what do you call invisibility of these crores and crores of workers. Lastly, I'm glad Mr. Lahiri raised the slum question, the urbanization question. We keep saying how squalid slums are. One of the reasons, of course, they are close by, but there's another reason the houses are close by. But the other reason is that they don't have proper water or sanitation. They don't have proper infrastructure. And the reason they don't have proper infrastructure is not that they don't want proper infrastructure, it's because the city doesn't give them proper infrastructure. And the city does not give them proper infrastructure because the city believes, or every city has this policy, that if you are not legally on that land, legally on the land, then you are not entitled to water and sanitation. Now, often cities do anyway give it to them, but then they don't give them individual taps, they don't give them individual toilets, they give them community water, which comes, sometimes doesn't come. So one of the things that I think is really important is that you need to de-link the whole question of water and sanitation and other infrastructure, excuse me, like drainage and electric lights. You need to de-link it from the legality of whether that person is legally there or whether that land legally belongs to that person or not. You absolutely, and every single person in the urban areas who lives in the urban area should get access to water, to enough water to live their daily lives, and of course to a toilet, because that's the need of the person. It's not the need of the land. So you don't link the land with the facility. Another issue really that comes up with slums is that, yes, they don't legally own the land that they're living on. But cities don't solve that problem. Our land title issue is so complex that even people who have been living on a piece of land for generations, 50 years, they don't legally own or they don't have any rights. So, and there is no movement towards solving that, to giving titles or not giving titles. Either you remove them or you say that, yes, these are the titles that you have, or you rehabilitate. But there's no movement towards that. Our titling, our land laws are so complex and so messed, I will say confused, that everybody, good 30 to 40% of urban dwellers are illegal. I think I should end here And just one thing on which I want to say about women, all the things that I said, cash transfers benefits women, is more progressive towards women because they earn less or don't earn at all. So when they get money in their hands, it's good for them. Water and sanitation, it's something that women's duty, women's responsibility. And so providing water and sanitation makes a huge difference to them. So overall, I think we really need to change quite a few of the systems, the unorganized sector and the slum system, and have, of course, some kind of basic income. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There are two things that you said that make NREGA not the Lewis type of making unemployed people work for creating an asset, just making a cash transfer. Don't insist on their working. So that can be a substitute for the universal cash transfer. But I was looking for some fiscal instrument which will save money and which can move us towards universal basic income. Are you saying withdraw the NREGA, or are you saying keep NREGA, keep giving 100 rupees per adult and also have a universal basic income? You can take up in the discussion stage. And the second point that you made is about slums. Karthik is quite right. If I gave the impression that I'm against migration, no, I'm not against migration. I believe growth will take place at a differential rate in different places and people will move. This is India. I'm free to go wherever I want to, where I get a better income. But the issue is, city lights will draw so many people that no matter what you do, if you need orderly urbanization, you need some kind of control on demand as well as supply. And what Renana brought up is the issue of property rights. If we are going to give water, electricity, ration card, everything to wherever who is staying, then what happens to the urban property rights, including the government land? Are we saying whoever occupies whichever land, just give them the title? That is a revolutionary idea. I don't know what is the answer. We can take it up after the discussion, once the speakers have spoken. And let me alert Abhijit. Abhijit, first, congratulations. I haven't had the privilege of congratulating you. And we are delighted that we have a young Nobel laureate in his prime. We do get to meet Nobel laureates normally in their 70s and the 80s, not a Nobel laureate who is part of a panel talking about Indian problems and who is very much active in the field. Now, with these words, I want to invite Mr. Somanathan. I have known Somanathan for some time. He's one of the seasoned bureaucrats who has a deep understanding of the social issues, as well as an idea about what will fly politically. As a bureaucrat, he has to do that. So we look forward to hearing from you as to what can be done. What have we learned from the pandemic and the lockdown and the opening up, the migrants? What can we do? Over to you, Somanathan.
How much time do I have? I believe this session closes at 8.
Take about 10 minutes. Is that okay?
I would urge TV to take a little more time, because really we all need to hear from you, TV. And if I ask for the indulgence of the chair, we could move things back a little bit. We started a little bit late as well. So I'll just make a request to the chair to let's hear TV. I have
all the time. I have till midnight, no problem. So let's go ahead with 15 minutes.
Yes, certainly.
Okay. So first, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And it's very illuminating to hear so many people talk about the issues that I tackle every day in the form of files with a lot of red tape on them. I thought I would start, since the audience has a lot of people who are not necessarily from India, and perhaps even if they're from India, not necessarily familiar with everything that's been done, I thought I would owe it to the audience to do a very quick recap of what kinds of social safety net have actually been attempted in the COVID-19 context. So very quickly, free food grains, 5 kilograms per person and 1 kilogram of pulses per family for 800 million people, initially for 3 months, now extended for another 5 months, so that it's 8 months. Cash into approximately 200 million Jandan accounts held by women. Cash for the purchase of cooking gas, 3 cylinders of cooking gas into the accounts of 8 million women. Cash into Provident Fund accounts for 7.8 million enterprises for people whose wages are below 15,000 rupees. An advance release of the subsidy under the Prime Minister's Kisan Yojana, which is a quarterly payment. The first installment was advanced by 3 months. Then, as Renana mentioned, the construction workers' funds were liberalized and 4,000 crores were disbursed from there. There was a big increase in the budget for Narega. And as regards food provision for migrants, I just want to make a factual observation here. From the very first month, the states were given 3 months of unlimited drawal of food without any linkage to the number of ration cards, and it was to be drawn on credit. So that was actually available from March the 15th. In addition, in May, we announced a 10% increase in the state's quotas of free food to take care of people who are on the move, which is another 80 million. I mean, the entitlement is for 80 million people. Now, what were the results of what we did? So interestingly, we have some very detailed survey results. There's a consultancy called Dahlberg, which has done a survey with a sample size of in excess of 25,000 for each of the questions, covering 15 states and looking at the implementation of these programs in the months of April and May 2020. So I'll just highlight some of those findings. And by the way, I'm speaking here in my personal capacity, but I will reveal my biases by selecting the indicators that I want to select. In terms of the public distribution system, 91% of those surveyed had received food grains from the public distribution system. 9% were not covered, but of the 9%, 48% had still received free or subsidized grain from the state government. In terms of cash, 84% of the people surveyed had got cash from at least one of the cash schemes, the Jandan, the Jhabvala, the construction worker, or not Narega. In addition, just again a factual point, Renana was talking about the small number of people who actually benefited from Jandan because many of the accounts were inoperative. Yes, there are inoperative accounts, but the survey results with a sample size of 26,000 plus for this particular question, 72% of those surveyed had actually got money in their Jandan accounts for the woman in the family. Another interesting result in terms of social inclusion, the coverage under the Jandan and the Jhabvala cash payments was higher for scheduled tribes as a proportion than it was for scheduled castes. It was higher for scheduled castes than for backward classes, and it was higher for backward classes than for non-backward classes. In the case of the PDS, it was higher for the scheduled tribes than for the scheduled castes, higher for the scheduled castes than the backward classes, but slightly lower for the backward classes than the general category. Another interesting result of this survey was that the banking correspondence that we had introduced, I mean, the government from 2013 onwards had been introducing. We were all a bit skeptical about whether the system was working, but this survey shows that a lot of the Jandan account holders actually drew their money through these itinerant banking correspondents who actually come to your doorstep and disburse cash. I think I will just say a few points, a few observations for me as an economist turned administrator. I would say that we've always had this debate about what's the best way to distribute food to the poor. So why not vouchers? Why not food coupons? Why not a bigger universal basic income and they buy their food from whichever grocer's shop they want to? But it's an observation that strikes me that you can't eat a food voucher. And in a lockdown, nothing moves. The fact that we had a physical public distribution system with all its inefficiencies actually proved extremely useful in the last 4 months. So, because you can't eat a voucher. And we also found that, you can't actually use foreign exchange reserves to get food if international shipping lanes are closed. So neither vouchers nor foreign exchange is equal to food in a situation like this. Of course, it's not a situation that occurs very often. So the physical, this enormous physical distribution system that India has maintained for decades, and the very large buffer stocks, much higher than the recommendations of the buffer stock committee, which had suggested that the buffer stock should be for 2 months, and beyond that, we should import what we require. Paradoxically, they actually turned out to be a lifeline in this crisis. So that's just a factual observation. I'll just quickly respond to some of the points that other panelists had raised, starting with, of course, Abhijit Banerjee. As I said, while there was no announced scheme for migrants, there was actually an intergovernmental arrangement where state governments could draw 3 months of rations, irrespective of the quantity of eligibility in the ration system. And that was intended to take care of people who were not within the formal system. Several states did actually lift grains under that quota. And subsequently, this became free, which was announced in the May package. That's a factual point. Now, on rental housing, I agree completely that this is an area of future focus. It's not something that we can do during the pandemic, but we have announced a new thrust towards rental housing for migrant workers. It has 2 components. One, there are a lot of constructions that were made under the JNNURM, which are only partially occupied, and they're going to be converted into rental housing tenements with a private operator and with rates of rent that are not hugely subsidized and are such that a private operator would actually be able to maintain them if the construction cost is subsidized. So the construction cost would be free. The operator would need to maintain a clean, hygienic tenement with a minimum of space for each rental worker. So this is part 1 of that rental housing scheme. Part 2 is to get municipalities to give permissions on government or private land to put up rental housing by removing rent control restrictions, inviting the private sector to come in and run these tenements, including the real estate companies, with a viability gap provided by the government. So again, these are experiments. They have been launched. It will take time for them to establish themselves, but hopefully they will produce some successful results towards future rental housing. The One Nation, One Ration card, I want to give a factual clarification here to Renana. The intended design is that you can split the card. And if, let's say, the husband is in Bombay and the family is in Bihar, and they have a family of 5, they can actually, all that the husband would have to do when this is fully rolled out is to go to the ration shop in Bombay, produce his Aadhaar card. It's supposed to be completely electronic. Then his Aadhaar card is de-linked from the Bihar ration card, and he gets a new entitlement in Bombay equivalent to a family of 1. And of course, some entitlements are per person and some are per family. There will be some cost consequences when we split it, but the system is intended to allow that splitting. Narega doesn't really require a domicile, incidentally. You need to get a job card, and that's been referred to, but it doesn't actually require a domicile. As regards the question of the amounts being adequate, inadequate, yes, nothing I think would be adequate. So because the sums that we gave are not adequate, the sums that Karthik is proposing are not adequate. There's almost no sum that would be adequate for the kind of trauma that people have gone through. But the question that we face in public finance terms is, do you make your decisions in one big announcement at the beginning without knowing how long and how much you will need to spend? Or do you wait and keep releasing installments of public funds as the situation evolves? And we have definitely chosen the latter course, not the former. And which is why we initially announced 3 months of free rations, extended it for another 5 months. So it's now an 8-month ration. One can argue that we should have announced 8 months of rations in month 1, but I don't agree, because I think the situation is evolving so fast. There are so many things that we don't know even now. it's very useful to have more information before we make these decisions. And the information that comes in helps us make sure that the limited resources we have are targeted in the best possible manner. Of course, with all our incompetencies, information inadequacies, lack of state capability, all the problems with the laws, all the problems with the government systems, all of which we're aware of, but that's the system we live in, and that's the system we have to run during this crisis. I think it would be a mistake, and this point I'm taking from Dr. Ashok Lahiri, I think it would be a mistake to reorient the entire welfare system based on the short-run experience of this one pandemic. And I think, for instance, especially in the healthcare space, to decide healthcare priorities based on the experience of these 4 months, I think would be wrong. Are hospital beds and ICUs really the right long-term priorities? Very serious and important question. And I can only say that we haven't decided that they are our long-term priorities. They certainly are short-term priorities, and we're working on them, but they're not necessarily our long-term priorities. In terms of Karthik, and the very interesting points that he made, I just want to make a semantic point in the beginning, which is that purely in public finance terms, we are talking about a universal basic subsidy, because I wouldn't want to call taxes universal basic expenditure. I mean, there's a difference, in my view, between an income and a government subsidy. So I just want to be clear in my mind. We can, of course, market it or brand it as whatever we want, as a dividend, as a subsidy, as an income, as an entitlement, as a food stamp, whatever. But in this particular case, it is a subsidy. So it is a subsidy in my book because I have many other subsidies. And this is the point that Dr. Ashok Lahiri was also talking about. And in a sense, we do have some kind of universal basic subsidy, but it comes in kind, in the form of food. So we have a very large section of the population that is entitled to this particular universal basic income. I'm very clear, of course, that Karthik is not talking about reducing that. I understand that. He wants that to be increased with a cash subsidy, and I follow that argument. But I'm just coming to the point that it comes on top of something that we have, which is already pretty expensive. Now, in terms of the political economy, the political economy problem with a universal basic subsidy is that if you've given that entire, let's say we had, let's do a thought experiment. So we had this universal basic income on March the 22nd, and it was already provided for, and we were giving it to everyone. Would it have been an acceptable political economy decision for the government to say, look here, we knew that there were going to be some kinds of calamities or other. It could have been a pandemic, it could have been something else. And that's why we provided you this universal basic subsidy. So please use it now to keep yourselves healthy during this pandemic. It just wouldn't have been acceptable. And this is the problem that in the political economy that you face in India, certainly, and I'm not sure that India is very exceptional in this regard, governments are expected to respond. And governments are expected to respond by giving something more than you already have. So the limited point I'm making is that the case for a universal basic income must stand or fall on its own without a linkage to special calamities or incidents like the pandemic, because that's not going to be an answer for these incidents. Even if we had a substantial universal basic income, we would have had to do something more. And that's true of countries which have very strong social security systems. They've had to do something more. And if you have to do something more, the higher the starting point in terms of your fiscal costs, the less room you have in a pandemic. So that's just an observation in terms of, I would like to de-link this universal basic income from the response to a pandemic. Now, Karthik made the point that we need to do more in fiscal terms, and that the bond markets and the analysts would actually understand that if we spent more, it would stimulate the GDP, it would stimulate income, and therefore the denominator of the fiscal deficit to the GDP would improve, and therefore they would be less worried about the increase in the numerator. It's a plausible case. I accept that it's a plausible case. But let's remember, the increase in the numerator is known, quantified, and published. The increase in the denominator is probabilistic, dependent on which macroeconomic model you're using, and it's in the eye of the beholder. So when we deal with hard-nosed credit rating analysts or bond markets, it's not very obvious that they would all agree with Karthik. I wish they would. And if they did, our jobs would be easier. But it's not clear to me that they do. And by the way, we do talk to these people. So I don't necessarily accept that this linkage, it's a very fine linkage and I accept it, but I'm not sure that the markets necessarily respond that way. It's not clear to us that they would. Therefore, for us, making actual decisions on this numerator versus the potential denominator with a higher stimulus, etc., it's quite a difficult balancing act. And I would also add that in the short run for this pandemic, it's not clear to me that the restraint on demand is lack of cash. I think there is a serious increase in the precautionary demand for money. 43% of the Jan Dhan account holders have not withdrawn the money. And this survey also speaks about whether they were able to withdraw and couldn't and didn't, or whether they were not able to withdraw. And there is a little bit of both. But the point is, I think in the middle of this pandemic where people are scared of the future, they're not necessarily likely to spend more if we just transfer money into their accounts. I found the observation on converting Narega into a universal basic income very interesting, because that's the first time I've heard someone suggest a universal basic income with a suggestion about how to fund it, beyond the general suggestions about do better in terms of taxation, do better in terms of public expenditure control. So I think that's an interesting proposition, needs to be studied. You would lose the self-targeting that occurs with Narega, because not everyone opts for it, because they need to actually be willing to do the hard labor, as you put it. And so that's an interesting proposition. I think I've probably taken even more time than I should have. So I'll stop here and be happy to answer any further questions. Thank you.
Abhijit, I believe you have to go. So would you like to add anything apart from what we benefited from your video lecture?
Abhijit, you're muted.
I just happened to have another call, so I should go. I thank you for allowing me to speak by video, and I learned a lot from the part of Renana's talk and Mr. Somanathan's talk. Thank you. I need to go. Unfortunately, this is a hard deadline again. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye. 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 Thank you. Okay. Now it's the time for discussion. I'll just add one thing. What Somanathan said. Firstly, I'd like to distinguish between a subsidy and a transfer. A subsidy is a commodity-specific one. And the government of India has specialized in giving subsidies which are linked to commodities. The government is not getting enough credit for it. One of the subsidies that has been abolished or removed, which many of us have been dreaming about, is the petroleum subsidy. It has come down tremendously. And this has been done without any hullabaloo, particularly the distortion that was there between petroleum or gas, petrol and diesel. So the government must be congratulated on it. Now in a pump, you don't find any difference in the price of diesel and petrol, which should have been for ages. Now, the second question is on the PDS and buffer stock. I'm not convinced that, I'm sure PDS has served us well in crisis, but whether we still had more than enough to meet this crisis. Even after this crisis, the buffer stock is more than meeting another 3 crises. So the system has got so distorted through a high MSP, which is politically determined. And everyone talks about the rationalization of food subsidy. No one has got the courage to talk about an MSP reform. I'm not talking about economists, I'm talking about the political leaders. So this has become a hostage. The food subsidy system, if you decompose it, I don't know how much it is for the consumer and the poor and how much it is for the producers. I've said enough. So now it's open questions and answers. So anyone who wants to ask a question, please let me know. Or actually, since we don't have too many people, just raise your hand or go ahead and ask the question.
I think we have
Pranab has his hand up first, I think.
Pranab, Raghu, and yeah.
Okay, first Pranab, then Raghu. I can't see any raised hands here. Am I missing something? Anyway, go ahead. Okay.
Thank you. I just want to raise 2 or 3 points. Number one, let me start with the issue that Abhijit first talked about, that how our system is not oriented, particularly in a crisis, with the migration, with the migrants. That of course has been palpably obvious, and how our system has been really very callous to these people for months, not just for days. Now, one of the problems, some of the problems have already been touched upon, but one problem that has not been touched upon about migrants is their link with the labor market. Many of these migrants are brought by contractors. Now we have a migrant, I forget the exact name of the act. We have an act about migrants, and we are supposed to, if they lose their jobs, the act says that either the state or the contractor who brought them is responsible for their food, for their housing, and things like that. And that, of course, is completely ignored, because look what contractors did this time, and contractors do this all the time. As soon as the lockdown was announced on March 24th, and was given only 4 hours notice. By the way, this March 24th, South Africa also announced a lockdown. They gave people 4 days notice. But anyway, immediately the migrants called their contractors. Contractors' mobile phone, of course, was switched off, and most of these contractors absconded. So they were then completely abandoned. So this is a system. I think Renana has talked about registering, which probably would have helped. But I think we have to rethink about the link of these migrant laborers to this whole system. The act is there, but implementation of that act has to be streamlined. And second point that I want to make is also something that Abhijit mentioned, that we now have an urbanization of poverty. In fact, the government of India has done a reasonably good job, although after 7 excruciating weeks, I'm talking about the May announcement, after 7 excruciating weeks, it's a reasonable provision in the rural sector, more money for the NREGA, and also even the other announcements most of them came in the second package. But urban sector is not just the migrants. In fact, nobody knows the numbers of the migrants, but the overwhelming number of the people who are abandoned, nothing, income loss and everything, was in the urban sector. Think of the urban street vendors, large self-employed people. And one of the problems the government faces is that even if you want to give them cash, how do you reach them? In fact, by the way, most countries in the world, now we have accounts. I think hundreds of countries in the world, most of them developing countries, immediately gave people cash. India is one of the least performing in respect of cash assistance in a crisis, even compared to other developing countries. Now, one of the problems our bureaucrats have told us that how do you give them cash? There are ways of giving them cash in a crisis situation. The way we vote, put them indelible ink on your fingers if you want, or send money orders by post. Our postal system is working even under lockdown. But after many, many weeks, then you say we increase the NREGA budget. But meanwhile, how do you reach this cash to these large numbers? I would say tens of millions of urban workers who were abandoned, urban self-employed and urban wage workers who were abandoned. Third point that I want to mention, I don't want to take too much time, is something that Renana mentioned. I'm a little surprised by your suggesting almost that you and I have been advocates of universal basic income for a long time, but please don't suggest it as a substitute. I know the fiscal bureaucrats would like that as a substitute for NREGA. I should tell you, the first time I personally suggested universal basic income in a meeting in Delhi in 2010. And in that meeting, there were many of the government economists and there were the NGOs. And the NGOs immediately were up in arms against me because they thought I'm suggesting universal basic income as a substitute for NREGA. I remember Aruna Roy, Jean Drez, and many others present in the meeting were up in arms against me. I said, wait. I'm giving you a scheme. It's over and above NREGA because I think, maybe Renana doesn't think so, I think NREGA has a different value in our system. And therefore, I went out of my way as early as 2010 to give a scheme how to fund it. One may have questions about my scheme, but I gave a scheme of reducing subsidies, etc. Other subsidies, but not NREGA, because as I said, NREGA does other things. My last major point is, and this is to Mr. Somanathan, you've referred to some of these surveys where you, now I would like to know about these surveys a little bit more. Are these administrative surveys? Because most of the non-government surveys, there have not been too many, but the ones that I have seen give a completely different picture about how many people have got, not PDS. PDS works reasonably well. PDS problem is, Ashok mentioned. I think PDS problem is more the MSP oriented. I think that is the MSP related PDS that I have problems with. The PDS worked, but even in terms of Jan Dhan, we have earlier surveys carried out by others. I can give you references if you want. Half of the poor women do not have a Jan Dhan account. This is 2017 survey. But other more recent ones that I have seen, even after the pandemic started, give us a different picture of how many people have got money, how many people have got, even NREGA. As of this week, July 13, the ministry has announced that how many people have been given 100 days work is 220,000. How many people have job cards, by the way, in India? 140 million. And this is less than 250,000 who have got 100 days, who have been given 100 days work. But even those who have not been 100 days work, in any case, most of the time it is not given. Even those who have not been given 100 days work, the numbers are much, much less than the 140 million people. And there are many areas in which the government has not been able to provide those who are demanding work. And of course, this does not cover the urban. And I think this system has particularly shown that with the urbanization of poverty, we are completely unprepared as yet for doing things about reaching urban poor people. Let me stop there.
Thank you. Pranabda, I think you have branded me as a government economist. So now I'll ask another past government economist, Raghuram Rajan, to raise this question, but not as a government economist, please.
Sure. As an ex-government economist, by the way, I didn't know this was open to the press yesterday, so I would have chosen words a little more carefully, but the sentiment was what I intended. Look, I think there's a danger of confusing three issues in this crisis. One is relief, the second is repair, and the third is stimulus. Now, unlike the normal recession, there's an enormous amount of destruction going on in this crisis to households, but also to firms. And that's where the relief and the repair come in. To see this as part of stimulus and therefore, to make the calculation, is the additional growth from this kind of spending worth it, I think is a mistake. That there is an impairment in the productive capacity of the economy. Certainly you can see that with firms, but you can also see that with households who are not spending enough on food, etc. It does impair their longer term functioning. Those kinds of spending should not be looked at in terms of, is the multiplier effect enough to outweigh the spending? It should be seen as necessary to preserve the capacity of the economy. And that's something that I think the credit rating agencies would agree with. This kind of spending to keep it afloat is necessary at this point, whatever the deficit numbers. I think on stimulus, you could have an argument, is the additional stimulus here worth it or not? I still think we may have to do a substantial amount going forward, but that's a different issue. And let's keep that separate. Two more points on the relief. I think this, Mr. Somanathan also said this, that looking at the increase in the accounts, it seems as if we've done enough in terms of giving people money. Well, you have to worry a little bit about why that increase is taking place. As he mentioned, it could be because they can't get access to those accounts. But it could also be that if you haven't announced what's going to happen beyond 3 months, a lot of people are saving that money for precautionary reasons. I have no idea how long this is going to last. If I've got a little bit, let me save some. And to the point that Pranabda talked about, that other surveys are sending other messages. I've certainly seen some description of people skipping meals in the face of this pandemic. And so it is suggesting that one shouldn't take for granted the fact that money is accumulating in these accounts as people have plenty to spend. Let's not worry about it. That in fact, they may be saving because they really are worried about the future. Last point on the repair front, and I'll reiterate, I think if you've got a lot of firms which are going bust, they're subtracting from the productive capacity of the economy, and helping them is certainly going to be long-term worthwhile in terms of the money spent. Let me stop.
Ashok, we are about 17 minutes behind schedule. So I'm going to request you to help us manage the time so we bring this session to a close at 8:30 with a hard stop. And by that token, request everybody who has a question to be very crisp about it.
So I have got 5 raised hands now. Raghavan Srinivasan, Manoj Panda, Shantanu Patnaik, Raghu Kavale, and Vijay Joshi. So in this order, please maintain discipline as far as time is concerned and be short and precise.
Okay,
so, Raghavan
so
Srinivasan?
Yeah. So a couple of very brief points. One were relating to MSP. MSP, I think, it is seen as larger than what it is, particularly from Delhi. The reality is that it
Raghavan, we can't hear you.
Basically works as a price setting.
Yeah, we can. If you come closer to your mic, or you may have to turn off your video.
Okay. So, MSP basically works in about 3 states and parts of 3 or 4 more states. and it's otherwise it only works as the price signaling mechanism for the trade. You know, in Chennai, where I live, for instance, outside Chennai, FCI has done no procurement for so many years that it has leased out its godowns to a Hero motorcycle company. So, to that extent, you know, what we need really is a different system, and I think some of these agri-marketing reforms which the government has set on, if they are completed or seen through, would help in that other thing. The second issue, I think, which was raised by some of the speakers is really on the PDS system, and there again, I would say that the view from the states and some of the other states is quite different. In fact, Tamil Nadu, which has a universal PDS system, has performed quite admirably during this crisis, and it did open it up to universal access, including migrants, and so there are models available, I think, where other states can learn from that. So these were just 2 points that I wanted to make. Thank you.
Thank you. Manoj Panda.
Yeah, thank you. My question is, if NREGA has been actually very successful in rural areas and it is work on demand, the question I'm putting is, what kind of schemes we can think of in urban area that can be given on demand? Basically in the nature of work. Can it be, for example, can it be health and education sector or some other sectors?
Antanu Paramanik.
Yeah, hi. So in terms of receipt of relief, I also have a similar observation from our Delhi NCAER coronavirus telephone survey, as mentioned by Professor Burton. I mean, there is a significant level of urban exclusion has happened and is happening. So it would be good to know the solutions for that in situations like this, because as we know, the impact in terms of income loss, etc., is much more severe in urban areas. And another point also Professor Burton mentioned, and Somanathan also mentioned about the Dalberg survey and the estimates of household receiving the relief, etc., is much higher compared to what we have also seen. But I think I'd like to clarify one thing. The target population for Dalberg survey is very different, which is the low income, the BPL households. But our survey and perhaps many other surveys where the general population is the target population. So that's why we have also seen much less proportion of households receiving such relief in terms of both ration and definitely cash. Cash received is about 30% we have seen, but that's a general population survey compared to Dalberg survey, which is more like a PPL household targeted survey. Yeah.
Thank you. Raghu Kavale.
Mine is more of a tech and business observation. Most of the migration, and we saw this wonderful chapter on demographics, I think not in the last economic survey, the previous economic survey. So most of the migration was from the south of the Vindhyas to the north. And that is creating its own sociological problems. What I observe over the last 3 months, ever since this lockdown, is I know Dr. Abhijit Banerjee said people are sending buses to Bengal to get people. But then there are a whole set of people who are talking to us as to how to automate a whole lot of tasks, which is automation. So once you start automating, you use robotics or whatever you call that set of automation, those jobs disappear. So there are two impacts on this migration. One is the sociological aspect, and second is the jobs themselves disappearing. Now, I only see it from a business perspective because I live in Bangalore, I live in the center of the south, I can see the impact. But I'd just be curious if nobody has even talked about the fact that why is it that there is one portion of the country south of Vindhyas, and why is it that all the migration went from the south of the Vindhyas to the north? Of course, we did have some local migration to villages here, but those have been subsequently reversed. But I think that's something that I would leave it to better minds over here to talk about.
Okay, last question from Vijay Joshi. Vijay?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Three very brief remarks on macroeconomics. Firstly, I think the contrast that Raghu drew between relief and between repair and stimulus is too sharply drawn. A multiplier expansion in demand is important for repairing. It isn't, I don't think it's right to draw the contrast as sharply as he drew it. Secondly, the point about precautionary savings being a problem. Precautionary savings are a problem because people are not assured that the cash transfer will continue for some time. If they are told that that 1% of GDP is going to be spent as a cash transfer from now on, the precautionary savings problem will go away. And thirdly, there seems to me a good case for the first year of such a program of say 1.1% of GDP of extra spending to be financed by helicopter money. Because that has the advantage of not increasing debt and not creating any crowding out. The risk is inflation, but I don't think that is a risk in present circumstances because oil prices are low, the balance of payments is comfortable, and even though there is some inflation, there is a lot of disinflation coming. And a revival of demand is necessary is an essential condition for rebuilding supply chains. So these are my three remarks. I would be particularly interested to know Raghu's view, but I suppose there's no time on the helicopter money part of what I just said.
I think I will just
Thank you.
Just to ensure that I'm again called as the chair, I will not allow any more questions, but as a good chair, I'll allow Karthik, Renana, and Somanathan to have the last word. Karthik, your chance. Not a long lecture, but a short.
Yeah, just 2 minutes. I think, there's a lot of excellent points raised in the discussion. I just wanted to say three things. I think one, in responding to Renana on NREGA, I think the main point I was making there was not to kind of defend NREGA in its form as the perfect program, but I think as a very powerful illustration of this concept that a well-designed social protection program can have huge positive effects on the economy more generally. And I think, and I must say, those results have just stunned me. It reversed my own priors. And I repeat this because I think there are many more skeptical, standard conservative economists who say this kind of welfare program is increasing spending without returns. And I think when you have these microeconomic frictions in the economy, there really is no conflict. I think second, and thank you, Vijay, for coming in, because I was also, I think, not so sure about Raghu's characterization that these three things are completely different. I agree that the goals are different, but sometimes you can have instruments that allow all of them. And so if what you want is kind of keep some of your MSMEs and smaller production capacity online, every kind of, I grew up in Ahmedabad, I still have my WhatsApp group with my high school friends who are mainly running MSMEs. And, to a point, I think, credit, they're not even interested in taking the credit because there's no demand. So to that extent, I think, what is good about the demand channel is then you're not picking sectors, picking winners, losers. And so to that extent, there might be no conflict. So I agree that the goals are different, but the instrument of a modest supplemental transfer, I think, can hit multiple goals. And I think the last point to Dr. Somanathan, I completely agree that, the merits of an IGD in some sense should be considered independent of the pandemic, that one should not kind of say this is something that we do for the pandemic if the fundamentals are not sound. I think the point of this paper that we wrote extensively last year is to kind of go after microeconomic friction after friction after friction to kind of say how this is something that's not just social protection, but really about, helping the economy more broadly. I think the connection to the pandemic has to do partly with option value. The the fact, so I agree with you that even if you had this, you would need to do something more, but you would have the ability to react faster than what has happened right now. I agree completely with Vijay and others that the predictability and the confidence for the vulnerable is in some ways even more important than just the transfer. And so there, I think there's a very real tension, right? The fiscal side wants to be prudent in terms of not overplaying your hand and committing in advance. But to the extent that a big part of the recovery is also going to be driven by expectations, there is a part of that balancing game which has to be played, and and setting expectations so that people feel confident to start spending again. And then the last point, of course, is the mobility, and this is a benefit that would obviously be mobile, wherever people are. So let me stop there, and thanks again.
Ashok?
Renana? It's Renana, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I just
Renana?
Very briefly, what I was suggesting on the NREGA was actually not just shutting down NREGA and putting the money to universities. What I suggested was that you already have a very, very large number of self-directed who have job cards. Why do you have to make them? They're already there. Why do you have to make them work? Just transfer the 100-day money to them maybe once a month, or maybe even 2 or 3 lump sums. So that's what I'm saying. You'd save a lot of money, you'd save a lot of hassle, you'd save a lot of leakages. So that was my point there. My point on the land issue was, I was not suggesting that you just hand over land to whoever wants to come in. What I was saying was that there are many settlements in urban areas who have been there for many, many, many years, and those land issues need to be solved. Those people, once they get a certain land title, they may stay or they may just move out. But we don't have the mechanisms to solve those land issues. But my main point there really was that in the urban areas, and of course in the rural, but in the urban especially, you need to provide universal water and universal sanitation. And that came out very strongly in the crisis. And you need to de-link it from the status of the land, completely de-link it. So no matter what kind of land you're living on, whether you're an illegal or legal land, you get water and you get a toilet. And thirdly, somebody mentioned street vendors as an urban, one of the groups which are having a lot of difficulty. One of the things we are proposing is that one should open the markets, but like you have opened malls and you have opened other markets for the middle class, the street vendors markets should also be opened, of course, with certain rules and regulations governing them. But that has not been done. So street vendors markets are all shut, whereas all the other markets are open.
Thank you. Somanathan, you may have your last word.
Okay.
Unmute your
bureaucratic credibility is very low. Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, you have the last word.
Bureaucratic credibility is very low. I know that. So perhaps many of you thought I made up those numbers, but they were actually by a private consulting agency. And I think the real reason for the difference in the perception was explained by Shantanu Pramanik, because the Dalberg survey covers people that they see as poor. So the higher proportions of receipt by the poor is actually, I think, a good sign for me as an administrator, that more of the poor got it than didn't get it. And if the others didn't get it, well, that's a factual difference, and we can argue about how much we should do for them. I too, like Vijay Joshi, would really like to know what Dr. Rajan thinks about helicopter money, and what he would think would be a safe level for expenses on repair. I mean, what's the safe level of the fiscal deficit, or maybe safe is the wrong word. What's the appropriate level of the fiscal deficit up to which one should finance repairs? But I guess there's no time. So I would love to hear that too. Thank you.
Maybe we should give Raghu 30 seconds on this.
Raghu, 30 seconds if you can give an answer. Go ahead. No more than 30 seconds.
Sure. Let me try. One, I think that, don't mistake me, I'm not saying stimulus is not useful. I think they're all part of the same process. I just want to say this time, repair is really important. So if you have a firm which is unable to function, that's a loss to GDP going forward. And so if it can benefit from additional funding, a writing down of some of its debt, it may actually contribute significantly more than just the normal Keynesian stimulus. That's the point I was trying to make. It's over and above that. Now, we're already actually, if you talk about helicopter money, Vijay, I don't know what you mean, but if you're talking about the central bank financing the government, look at the reverse repo, how much is going into that? That's 7 lakh crores when I last saw it. That's the extent to which the government is being funded by central bank money. Now, it's not free. The central bank has to pay the banks the reverse repo rate, but that's the funding that's going on right now. Now, to what extent can that happen? Well, so long as the banks aren't lending, the central bank is filling the gap between bank lending and what is needed, say, from the government side or elsewhere. So the central bank is becoming a financial intermediary. That can happen so long as the credit offtake from the banks is very limited. When that changes, the central bank will have to reverse very quickly. Now, that's really the constraint right now. To Mr. Somanathan's point, I think you could do more. The reality right now is not to say that open the floodgates and spend on anything. The reality is that we need to spend on those firms which will benefit the economy going forward. So we need to spend on profitable firms which are now in danger of being sucked under because they haven't produced revenues for 4 months, but have been incurring costs along the way. That's the kind of judgment that has to be made. And I think it will be worth it if it is made appropriately. I'm not saying abandon judgment, but we need to make those judgments because that's necessary for the longer run health of the economy.
Okay, now don't blame me if I bring this meeting to an end. It's Shekhar Shah who has been dictatorial and asked me to close this meeting. I'm sure we had a lot more questions to ask and the panelists could have enlightened us. But Renana and Somanathan, because Shekhar has instructed me to bring this session to a close. Let me thank you panelists and all the participants for a very rich discussion. I benefited from it a lot. I hope all of you did.
Thank you. Thank you, Ashok, and thank you to all our roundtable panelists, Abhijit, Somanathan, Karthik, Renana, and this was really a wonderful session. As you said, we could possibly go on for another couple of hours, but we do have a very good paper to discuss. Rakesh is also waiting in New Haven, and Barry has got up very early in Berkeley. So over to you, Rakesh.